Thank you for joining us for this evening's event. My name is Nick, and I'm one of the event's hosts here at Powell's Books in Portland, Oregon. Before we begin, I want to encourage you to check out our lineup of upcoming virtual events by visiting our website at powells.com. If you don't already do so, please follow us on social media on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. Tonight, we are super excited to welcome two of our hometown favorites, Ruiz Keil and Laini Taylor. Ruiz Keil is a Latinx writer and tarot reader with an eye for the enchanted and a way with animals. Her critically acclaimed debut novel, All of Us with Wings, was called A Transcendent Journey by the New York Times, right up there. All right. A San Francisco Bay Area native, Michelle has lived in Portland, Oregon for many years. She curates the fairy tale reading series, All Kinds of Fur, and lives with her family in a cottage where the forest meets the city. That sounds beautiful. All right. Inspired by the Greek myth of Iphigenia and the Grimm fairy tale Brother and Sister, Keil's second novel follows two siblings torn apart and struggling to find each other in early 90s Portland. All of her life, 17-year-old Iph has protected her sensitive younger brother Orr. But this summer, with their mother gone in an artist residency, their father decides it's time for 15-year-old Orr to toughen up at a wilderness boot camp. When their father brings Iph to a work gala in downtown Portland and breaks the news, Orr has already been sent away against his will. Furious at her father's betrayal, Iph storms off and gets lost in the maze of Old Town. Enter George, a queer Robin Hood who swoops in on a bicycle, bow and arrow at the ready, offering Iph a place to hide out while she tracks down Orr. Orr, in the meantime, has escaped the camp and fallen in with the Furies, an all-girl punk band, and the Furies, probably, not the Furries, sorry. The Furies, an all-girl punk band, and moves into the coat closet of their ramshackle pink house. In their first summer apart, Iph and Orr must learn to navigate their respective new spaces of music, romance, and sex work activism and find each other before a fantastical transformation fractures their family forever. Joining Ruiz Keil in conversation this evening is Laini Taylor. Taylor is a New York Times bestselling author of the Prince Honor book, Strange the Dreamer, and its sequel, Muse of Nightmares. Taylor is also the author of the global sensation, The Daughter of Smoke and Bone trilogy, and the companion novella, Night of Cake and Puppets. Taylor's other works include the Dreamdark books, Blackbringer and Silk Singer, and the National Book Award finalist, Lips Touch, 3 times. She lives in Portland, Oregon with her husband, illustrator Jim DiBartolo, and their daughter, Clementine. So this event will include an audience Q&A. So please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen if you'd like to ask a question, as well as if someone has typed a question that you'd also like to know the answer to, please upvote that particular question by clicking the thumbs up button. Most importantly, please consider supporting Michelle and Powell's by purchasing a copy of her new book from us. A link to buy Summer in the City of Roses along with Laini's books will be shared in the chat a couple times tonight. So Michelle and Laini, thank you so much for joining us tonight, and welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Cool.
Well, Michelle, I want to say a huge happy book birthday to you today for your second novel. I'm so excited, and I'm so glad I get to celebrate this with you. I love your books, as you know, and I want to tell everybody else that I found this book, Michelle's first book, which just turned 2, right?
Yeah.
At the library. It was just sitting on an end cap at our beautiful local library, and I picked it up, and I'd heard of it, of course. I didn't know Michelle, but you know, I was aware of this new novel, so I picked it up. But as soon as I started reading it, I knew I was going to be buying it. So I think I did almost immediately buy it, because you know, when you start reading a book and within just sentences, you just get that feeling, you just know that this book is for you, and you know you're in good hands, and it's so exciting. And that is the feeling I got from your book all the way through. It's just a magical experience. And so then when when you were showing arcs on Instagram, and we still didn't know each other, I shamelessly begged one off of you. And then we finally got to meet each other, and I love this book as well so much. And so I am so excited that you are writing these beautiful books. And also that this is set in Portland was so fun because I just haven't read very many books that are set in Portland. And that, we see shows that are filmed here or whatever, but it's a different kind of experience because they're not, it doesn't have the same grounding really. So I love your books and I'm excited to be here and congratulations.
Thank you. I'm so excited that you could do this for me. People just kept saying, when I first thought that I may have written a YA book, I wasn't certain at first. Like, have you read Laini Taylor though? That's what you should read. And I read Strange the Dreamer, and I was like, okay, maybe this book could be out in the world, and maybe it could be. I was just like someone who likes a lot of like, just sentences, just the sentence level and that sort of that sense of intensity with young characters, like, young characters that are experiencing really intense stuff. So I was like, oh, I had that same feeling. It's like, okay, here I am. I get this, right where I like to be when I read something. So I think that it's so nice we finally got to meet, and we're, we live, not too far from each other.
Yeah,
and
so I look forward to getting together again. But here we are virtually. And
yes.
I would love to talk about how you came to writing novels, because I think this is fascinating, because anyone who would read your work would think you have known that you were a novelist your whole life and have just been getting to it. But this is not the case, apparently.
No, this is not the case. I was always a reader. I mean, I've always been voracious about reading and passionate about reading. And I've been thinking so much, why didn't I know I was a writer younger? And I do have some ideas about that. I didn't know anyone who was a writer. I think that was really part of it. The other part is that I also fell in love with theater really early. And I was really just, devouring everything I could around theater. I, did young acting programs at ACT, and I was taking acting classes in San Francisco after, as like an older teenager and in my early 20s. And I just didn't know that was something I knew how to do. Finally, when I moved to Portland, and I was in college again, trying to finish up, like, I think at 32, I met someone who asked me to write a play with them. And we wrote this play together and produced it. And I was like, oh, I can write a play. I like that. And then my daughters were going to a free school. It was very early days of the Village Free School, which is still around in Portland. And a bunch of the students asked if they could do NaNoWriMo. They said, we want to do a NaNoWriMo thing, and we wonder if you could help, support us and facilitate and write a book with us. And so I agreed. I mean, I think they were in it, honestly, for the pizza, because I was known. I did like a really huge sectional at the time and was known to host like late night D&D with lots of pizza. So I think that was sort of like, okay, I see you kids. I know what you're doing. But it was great. So we all did it. And I just fell in love with the novel form.
Wow.
The book that I started in that NaNoWriMo workshop, which is actually a book that they chose. I gave them 4 story ideas, kind of rolling the dice. They picked the one that they wanted, which wasn't the one I thought they'd pick. And that book became my first novel. I just fell in love, and I had to teach myself how to write it. And then as it just began to form and form and form, I got, took little teeny steps into the writing world, and to the point where the steps finally led me to, agent querying and publication and the whole thing. So it took really 10 years from when I started the book to, when it actually became a book out in the world.
Yeah, well, I love that. That's an incredible story. I know another author who, 2 authors who co-wrote, and it was not NaNoWriMo, but their kids kind of dared them to do it, and that's how they wrote their first novel as well. So
I know, it's funny, you never know like what where your life will take you. That's one of the things that I'm really enjoying the most about this particular time in my life and in my writing, because I did so many things that seemed at the time like they weren't going to add up to anything in particular. I really ended up following a lot of paths that didn't, that seemed like dead ends, or pursuing interests that seemed to have no practical purpose whatsoever at all. And now I feel like I use all of those things and all of those experiences, even some of the experiences that were like really big mistakes, or that I thought were mistakes at the time, to really inform my work. So I just like to, I hope that people will be gentle with themselves, because actually, everything that you're doing has the power to transform into something else.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, I mean, you're not always ready for that easy path. I had a really circuitous path too. Like writing was too hard for me after college. I had nothing, I felt like I had nothing to say. So I went to art school and became an illustrator. And it was actually through learning how to like deal with some of my perfectionism issues and things like that with visual art, where it was like a little bit more obvious whether I was getting any work done than with writing. That like brought me back to writing and gave me the tools to, to deal with those issues in writing. So, I mean, it didn't seem to make sense at the time, but like looking back, and then that's what brought me to writing fiction as well. I mean, I love the windy paths, and they do bring something so much unquantifiable material to your work.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so how did writing the second novel then compare to writing the first? It's a piece of cake, right?
Oh yeah, so easy. Well, for one thing, I did a thing that was either incredibly wise or incredibly foolish. I mean, in retrospect, it all worked out, but there were moments where I was really unsure, where I had this idea for the book, and I thought, I will try to sell my book on proposal, which is something you can do after you've sold one book. So I knew my editor wanted to work with me again, and so I handed her this tiny little synopsis, and she was like, okay. So then I had a book contract, and then I had a deadline. And my last book I wrote in 10 years, and this book I had about 18 months. So at first it did not go well. I had this idea that was much more complicated, and that had way too many characters. And it really was a dead end that I kept trying to go down. And it didn't feel right. It was so weird to write this thing that felt so wrong. It just wasn't feeling right. When I finally decided that I had to focus on just the brother and sister, just Iph and Orr, the whole story opened up. And I started to understand what I needed to write, but I was so behind by then. And then I was kind of not even trusting myself really. So I was in a bind, and luckily I applied, applied for a residency that benefited future me very much, because it was the month before my book was due.
They trust you.
They trust me, right? I got the acceptance when I was visiting my mom and doing a book event in Colorado, and I was like, this might save me. I have a month where I can just go. And I did. I mean, I wrote literally half the book was done. And there was, I had about 45,000 words to go. And, but it all came out because I had been thinking about it. So I did learn that sometimes not writing is writing, for one thing. Thinking about it is writing. And it's just, it's not a process that I have yet learned to control.
Well, I mean, and the thing is that I know you're not an outliner, and the kind of books that you write, they have to be discovered along the way, I think. Yep. And, but I think we have a lot of similarities in that way. And the thing that continually amazes me is how much you can think when you sell that book on pitch. Maybe you're not an outliner, but you feel like you figured things out enough to convey that idea to an editor, right? And then you sit down to actually write it, and you realize just the absolute paper thin fragility of that thing that you thought was a book.
And it doesn't want to do that at all. I mean, at all. It was amazing to me what the book was really about. And I think that this is something that I'm beginning to see now that the process is kind of done. And I got to narrate the audiobook, which was lovely. So cool. I loved doing it. It was so much fun. But in reading it like that again aloud, I really started to realize that this book was actually very personal. It was kind of about my family in a certain way. It's allegorical, and the people are different, but the issues at the heart of it were really about the whole family. And when I started realizing that I was doing a thing where I was trying to only write from the two protagonists' point of view, but to have their parents be there almost like one of those figure ground things where you think you just see the kids, but if you look at it another way, their parents are in the picture too. And that, by the time we finally get to meet them, which really, isn't until the very end of the book, that we feel we already know them through their kids. And when I realized that that I could do that, that somehow made the whole book come to life. But I didn't know that. I was not going to be about parents, like, hardly at all,
Yeah.
actually, when I started. But there you go.
Well, I mean, I think, for me, I can feel it when a book, has gone through that discovery process. And I think that those books are so much richer than the books that you are able to figure out from the outset, that
Yeah.
there's a simplicity or a lack of complexity to a book that one is able to outline and then follow the outline. And that doesn't mean that those aren't good books, but there's so much richness in your books that I can't imagine how you could know all of that stuff up front in the way that it takes, 10 years or 18 months to put it together. But that's all of that said, let's talk about the actual book. I also want to talk to you about fairy tales and what they mean to you, as we lead into talking about Summer in the City of Roses, because one of your primary sources of inspiration for this book is a fairy tale that probably nobody's heard of, or not very many people. I'm sure there are fairy tale lovers in the audience.
Yes.
But it's not a commonly known one. So there's that, and then Iphigenia.
Yeah, either way, we say Iphigenia. I think it's more Iphigenia. I can't even say it the Greek way. My husband is Greek, and I can hear it in my head, but I'm not going to try to actually say it right, because I will not. But,
I didn't realize that your husband was Greek, that you actually, reflected that, the dynamic, the cultural background of your family in this family. But so brother and sister, and this myth or this tragedy, like, what, how did these come together, and what was your starting point, and fairy tales, first of all, what do fairy tales mean to you, and at what point in your life did they become meaningful in this way?
they really became meaningful through, I started, with my fascination with theater, and I wanted to know sort of what was at the root of theater. So I became interested in ritual. And at the same time, this was in the late 80s, early 90s, where we're having a resurgence again, but for a long time, not many people were that interested in tarot, but at that time they were. And so I was really working with the tarot a lot, just to work through my own personal issues, but I was also fascinated by all of the layers and the symbolism and the alchemy. And, that led me sort of to Jungian psychology. And, I was already very interested in psychological interpretations of roles through acting. So I had this whole rabbit hole that I got kind of like pulled down. And then in the 90s, this book came out called Women Who Run with the Wolves. And to anyone who hasn't read it, I recommend it, but it's the first book I always recommend to young people who are coming of age and who are, young adults, because I think that, it's written by Clarissa Pinkola Estes, who is a Jungian therapist and storyteller. And she uses fairy tale to talk about these transformations that we go through. And in this case, in this particular case, that, female identifying people might go through. I think it's valuable, honestly, for anyone, though. And that's where I first started to see this way that storytelling and fairy tales very specifically could could kind of permeate the work I was doing, especially in theater. Like when I wrote my first play, I was definitely looking at fairy tale there. So yeah, that's how I sort of got down this rabbit hole. And then I realized people study fairy tales. And so ever since then, I'm just, yeah, if you get me started, I will keep going. So.
I saw a quote, I think you said, my story's bones are made of fairy tales. And that's so awesome. That could be like a collection title or something, or a tattoo, or I don't know, but I love that. But so how did you come to putting these sources together as how did you arrive at, the original inspiration for this book, or what, the book you thought you were going to write, and were those sources, those influences in it from the start, or did you discover them along the way?
No, they were there. Those two were definitely there. So I loved the story of sister and brother. It reminded me, my daughters, I'm talking about them. Hi, guys. They have a very close relationship, and they were always unusually close as children. And there was something about the beautiful story in Sister and Brother where their instinctual selves manifest very differently. For the sister, she can hear the voice in the forest that's warning against drinking this water. And for the brother, he is more impulsive, but his instinctual self emerges because he becomes a deer. And so I saw these two, and then, of course, terrible things happen because this is not one of those Disney fairy tales. Really terrible stuff happens, but they're together the whole time. They're never apart. She marries a king, and in the Grimm stories, that's only like part one of the story. Like there's after the wedding, and that is always the weird part. And so, things get really weird. She is killed by her evil stepmother, who finds out that she's happy and who is jealous. But all the time, she's still like when she went to get married, she took her roe with her, her brother, who's the roebuck, and their fates are so intertwined. So I was thinking about that, as I'm an only child, and I'm sort of amazed at this sibling relationship that I see them having. And then I was also thinking about how we express difference and how difference gets expressed. And I'm very fascinated by fairy tales where humans turn into animals for a time. And it really makes me think about adolescence. And so I was thinking about that always. And then Iphigenia is a story for me about betrayal, because her father, agrees to sacrifice her to the goddess Athena so that the winds will blow so he can go and fight the Trojan War on behalf of his brother, whose wife was Helen. So, Iphigenia is told she's going to get to marry Achilles, and is, brought to her wedding, which is really her death. And in some versions of the play, she's snatched away at the last minute, replaced with a deer, which I thought was interesting, and taken to the temple of Artemis. So these stories both, I was thinking, even back when I wrote my play about Iphigenia, she's been really in there. And then later in another Greek tragedy about Iphigenia, her brother Orestes and she come together. And, Orestes is being pursued by the Furies because of a terrible thing he has done, and they rescue each other. And so I was thinking, so all of a sudden, these stories that are both really different start to be kind of the same. And I spoke to someone from the Oregonian, Amy Wong from the Oregonian this week, and she was like, I noticed that actually there's really trauma in both families in those tales. And she's like, I really did start to see them coming together. And that's what happened for me. It was the deer, though. It was the deer that first kind of helped me to connect the two.
Wow. Well, and there are so many other mythic and literary references in your books that I feel like one could reread them and reread them and reread them, and need to be constantly, unless you're a real scholar yourself, Googling to find out more and more hidden depth and hidden layers, which is super fun. But we heard a little bit about this of the synopsis. Well, we heard the synopsis of what it's about, but do you want to, by way of getting to do a little bit of reading, do you want to set the scene? So the book kicks off with an example of extremely horrendous parenting decision making.
I agree.
Betrayal that is not motivated by malice. It's this isn't Hansel and Gretel's stepmother or mother. I can't remember if she was their mother or something. Anyway, it's he's not a bad dad. He's just makes a huge mistake, and sends these kids inadvertently off into the world alone. So do you want to set us up and what happened there?
Yeah, so they're a very close family. They live in an affluent Portland suburb that is made up, but sort of near the city, but not in the city. The dad is an architect. He's been very successful. The mother is a dancer who's kind of given up her dancing career for her children, although she's still been trying to kind of follow that passion as she can. Her son is really sensitive and is homeschooled, and her son and daughter are really super close. So they're two teenagers, 17 and 15, and the mom gets an artist residency and goes away for a month. And she's never done that before. And the dad's finally in charge, and he decides he knows what's right. And it's sort of one of those family situations where everything parenting wise goes one way that one parent wants, not that I know that or anything. Not that I can be a little bossy. So it's like, so the dad really wants his voice to be heard, and, hears about this situation, decides that it's going to be the right thing, and makes a mistake, a big mistake, and has his son transported against his will to a wilderness boot camp. And when his daughter finds out, she flips out, just completely loses it at this work event in downtown Portland, and loses herself in Old Town late at night. And So she and her brother, they meet helpful characters that take them into their worlds, and both find themselves in Southeast Portland, unbeknownst to one another, trying to find each other, and also really in the meantime finding themselves, and sort of reconciling with why their family, which kind of almost seemed like the perfect, close, loving family, is suddenly just completely exploded. So that's sort of the setup of the book. Orr finds himself gets an interesting rescue from the boot camp, and finds himself with a riot girl band called the Furies. And Iph finds a friend. She finds this person, George. And George goes around at night trying to help people on the street that need help, kind of as a street medic, and also does a lot of social service and social justice work with homeless folks and drug addicted folks downtown, and lives by themselves, is on their own, is 17 also, but is very, has a very different kind of experience than Iph has had, and is hiding out in their Nana's old tow truck establishment, which is on Southeast Division before it was completely transformed, and was really mostly just tow truck places, and, barbecue repair stores, as I recall. That was my neighborhood. So the part that I'm going to read to you, though, actually takes place at a very familiar bookstore. And I usually would read from more of the beginning, but I don't think this is going to spoil anything. So Iph and George together have been trying to find Orr, Iph's brother. And Iph is on her own right now at Powell's while George does some of their social work business. And it's a very hot summer day as we begin. And we're beginning actually with chapter 12, called When Acting is an Art. Iph drops a dime into the violin case of the busker outside Powell's. Sorry it isn't more. The temperature inside the bookstore is deliciously just right, not over air conditioned like the mall, where Iph always ends up with a summer cold. Just cool enough for the relief pleasure loop to activate. And then there are the books, a whole city block of them. Room after room, floors and floors. Iph and Orr used to fantasize about being locked in Powell's overnight, their version of the brother and sister from the mixed-up files of Mrs. Baisley Frankweiler. They'd strategize about how they would hide, but more importantly, how they would spend the precious hours between the store's 11 p.m. closing time and when it opened again at 9 a.m. As always, Iph starts in the blue room at the drama shelf. Today she finds a sweet old edition of An Actor Prepares. Stanislavski was the Russian creator of the method and mentor to Lee Strasberg, who passed along this physical, psychological approach to Broadway and Hollywood actors. Iph had learned about Stanislavski because of her favorite version of Marilyn Monroe, all dressed down and bespectacled in her New York acting student days. When Iph had asked about method acting in her high school drama class, she was told it was old-fashioned and too complex for high schoolers. So she studied it herself, learning the techniques in secret and trying them out in class. Some were good, basic tune-ups for an essentially physical art. Some of the exercises felt clunky, more academic than useful, like the sense memory technique where you recall physical details of something in the past to evoke the emotion called for in a scene. Ip's approach is more visceral, like a dancer's. In dance, the movement and music should be enough to evoke the feeling. Iph feels like the text and relationship should do the same in a play, at least when you're on stage. But before that, during preparation, Stanislavski is very useful. She grabs An Actor Prepares, which is at this point a comfort read, and heads for the cafe for a nice sit and several gallons of free water. There are ghost prints of Ip's childhood everywhere in this place. On the maps they offer at the big info desk, she can trace her own development from the toddler-sized tables in the picture book section of the Rose Room to the middle reader stack she haunted and adored until she got the theater bug and became a professional lurker in her special section of the Blue Room. Ever devoted to his Redwall books, Orr had stayed in the Rose Room until last year, when he started making forays into the Gold Room for fantasy and sci-fi. Iph closes her eyes against tears for the millionth time that day. She must be premenstrual. What had she been thinking of, ripping up Orr's number and flushing it away? If she had it right now, she'd be outside at the payphone with her second to last quarter. Clearly, Powell's has undone her. She misses Orr and Mom, even Dad. But how can she go back? Even with the sweetness of their shared language and familiar bodies and beloved faces, she can't imagine the old life being anything but suffocating after her days in the real world with George. Her heart beats hard, a sign of dehydration. The tables in the cafe are all occupied. Tourists with stacks of books and shopping bags, moms with little kids, street people drinking the free water like she is. Except she can't forget. For her, this is a choice. She gulps a final cup of the cold water and heads for the bathroom. It's when she's alone in the stall that she remembers Velma's velvet bag slung over her shoulder. She reaches inside, silk chiffon. Her fingers know without looking. She pulls the fabric gently from the bag. A scarf? No, a dress. An antique treasure that surely Velma should have kept. Its provenance is likely late 20s or early 30s, with a painterly scattering of wildflowers on a ballet pink background. It has short, barely there sleeves, a low ruffled surplice neckline, and a flowing bias cut skirt. If's chest burns with disappointment, with want. This is exactly the sort of dress she wears in her leading lady daydreams, but as always, there is no way it will fit in real life. The best vintage clothes, like so many other things Iph covets, are made for the slight and slender. So sweet of Velma, though. She folds the dress carefully and slips it back in the bag, pees, and heads out of the cafe for a favorite bench of hers next to the section for small press poetry and zines. Maybe when Mom comes home, she will give the dress to her. Before she sits to read, Iph looks for books by Velma Smith and finds nothing. She checks big press poetry too, but no luck. She settles on the bench and wishes hard for $5. Iced tea and a chocolate croissant sound like heaven. After that, a nap. Iph looks around. The section is empty. She lies back on the bench and closes her eyes. She sits up too fast, dizzy. Now that she's cooled off, she feels how hungry she is. She lowers her head between her legs like she does when she's worried she might faint. Psst. She looks up. Is someone talking to her? Is she imagining things? Psst. The sound seems to be coming from a cylindrical rack of books. There's a sign on the rounder, Portland Presses. A deep green hardbound book seems to be emitting some sort of glow. It's often like this at a bookstore, where a title seems to call to you from its place on the shelf. Keep telling yourself that, says a little voice in If's head. It is in her head, right? She gets up and walks to the rounder, picks up the shiny green book. The source of light is the book itself, a figure on the cover embossed in gold, a riot girl mohawked Artemis with a bow and arrow and a dog at her heels, basically the patron saint of George. I'm going to stop right there. So
I
that's just
don't want you to stop because I love what comes next.
what comes next is fun. It has to find a way to get money to get the book for George, and it might involve a little bit of impromptu Shakespeare recitation and busking outside of Powell's.
Oh,
But yeah.
so dreamy. I mean, so you always work in a lot of Shakespeare as well, which is, one of the other rich layers, and I love it. And I mean, I really felt your knowledge, your deep knowledge and love of the theater coming through. So even before I asked you, do you have a theater background? It was really clear. Not that I, am any judge of that, but it just sings off of the page.
Yeah, that was really fun to get to write. It really helped me. I had a really hard time actually getting into Iph. Orr was really easy for me, but Iph, and I think it wasn't until I remembered what it was like in my little head back in those days when I saw everything through this method acting lens. Then I was like, okay, I know who this girl is. I know how she thinks. Everything is like filtered through this lens. And then, that really helped me understand the family that she came from too, where everyone is an artist and everyone is always trying to sort of link up their experiences with the work that they want to do.
Yeah.
And that was part of what I actually wanted with this book. I don't know if it's as obvious, but I thought there's a German word and I can never remember it, but it's one of those amazing compound words. And it means, it's like Blundigsroman, but it's like another one that means coming of age as an artist. And if anyone knows that in the chat, like 100 million points to your house, like it's but
someone's Googling it right now, I'm sure.
But yeah, but anyway, it's a great word. And that was sort of what I was hoping for too, was like a coming of age as an artist story. Because I think that's a very specific kind of person to come of age as,
Mhm.
whether you know that's you or not.
Right. Yeah, well, it's so cool to see Powell's as well. And, I was struck, on the one hand that, setting your book in Portland in the 1990s solved the problem of your siblings being able to actually be lost in their own city in a way that, lost in a way that isn't really possible anymore. They would find each other. It would be much easier. The sense of being distant and unreachable and would, we don't have that anymore. So there was that, but also what a cool era you have evoked. And, Portland in the 90s. So we didn't move here to 2001. So I missed that. I was in the Bay Area though during those years. But so when did you move here, and what about the 90s really inspired you to recreate that setting, that particular Portland?
I will answer your question, but I first want to mention that my nephew, Sarah Quevedo, was the one who found the word. So thank you, Thayer.
There we go.
And I'm glad that you're here. Um, so anyway, I still can't pronounce it. I don't know. No, I'm not even going to try. But what I will do is tell you that I moved to Portland in 1993 when I was pregnant with my first daughter, Luciana. And Portland was this sort of little oasis for us. I had sort of wanted to move back to California to be closer to my family, back to San Francisco. We had been living in Humboldt County, going to college at Humboldt State in the tiny little redwood town of Arcata. And we wanted to move somewhere new to have our baby and start our family. And the city was just a little too much for my partner. He was from Buffalo, though, and something about Portland reminded him a little bit of Buffalo. So I came here, a friend lived here, and I just started to be very charmed by like the sort of sleepy quiet of the place, where it was sort of like a big, small town at that time. And, there were things that were troubling, in that there was like a lack of diversity. The first year I tried to make tamales at Christmas, I, had a very difficult time figuring out where to get the stuff.
Is
That
Humboldt very diverse?
No, see, that was,
Okay.
if I was a little bit, no. So I was a bit desensitized in a certain sense because,
Right.
coming from the Bay Area
We
to
moved here from
Humboldt,
Oakland.
right?
So it was a huge drastic difference for sure. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely, right. And so, there was definitely that. But there was also, and sometimes it's really easy to kind of get cranky about that here for me. But writing the book, it really reminded me of the beautiful things that were here. There was so much alternative stuff, like for parents. We had a home birth, for instance, that was paid for by the Oregon Health Plan back then, amazingly. There were all kinds of, there was this great, preschool co-op with all of these like artist parents. Everybody's, was in a band or a painter. It was just really cool. Like we felt like it was a place to be young parents, but also still be ourselves. There was also amazing activism happening around harm reduction and around, needle exchange for drug users. And this person that I met who is amazing, Teresa Dulce, was a sex work activist and a performance artist, and who created this zine called Danzine, but also did all this street outreach work on 82nd Avenue. And I met her when we started. I had volunteered in the needle exchange van every Friday night for ages with her. And there was also a thrift store, which sort of appears in the book. So I was seeing all of this sort of grassroots kind of do it yourself activism, and again, the free school that started up, that was a little later, but that whole sort of vibe and energy of let's think about this differently and do it differently, that I really loved. And that really, writing the book really helped me re-engage with what I thought was magical about this place, actually, and I'm very grateful for that.
Yeah. Well, it's it is a very magical vision of Portland, which I love. In All of Us with Wings, you are drawing inspiration to a degree from your own story with the main character. And most of the characters in that book are have been, have raised themselves, are young people raising themselves who are alone and have to find their way in the world. This is very different for Iph and Orr. They do, come from a stable family, but there's a lot of things that you take on in this book. I'm curious, what was it that you particularly wanted to examine with this story? I mean, there's so much in it, but going into it, what were you thinking of looking at, and what emerged as you wrote?
Yeah, I think what really emerged was the need to heal from generational trauma, and how parents who have maybe had some trauma could potentially raise their children in such a way as to keep them protected and safe, and to let them be kids, and still how that generational trauma that the parents have experienced passes down and expresses itself. And I saw that while we can do a lot of healing as parents, stopping cycles of abuse or neglect, we still are those hurt people, and we are still growing and transforming all the time that we are parenting.
Right,
And
that's sort of like the
becoming
starting point, is the not abusing, not neglecting. That's just like the baseline, and from there, there's so much
right.
more work to do.
That's right. And I think sometimes that's not even, and maybe sometimes a parent in that position, not saying me, might be a little overprotective too of their child. And so in trying to protect their child from what they went through, maybe there's this sense of like a secret, a family secret, something unexpressed in a family. And maybe there's fear too that comes through. Like when I noticed about the father, I really had a hard time with him because I knew he was a good person. How could he make a choice like that? Because I don't agree with that choice. And I thought, well, that's a fear-based choice. My choices I make that I don't like in my life mostly now are based out of fear. And so I thought, maybe what is he afraid of? And it really made me understand that he is coming from a place of having lost someone very close to him who reminds him a lot of his son. And so he is coming out of that place. The mother has had a very difficult childhood that she won't even talk about. And that secret history is kind of lived out in a certain way by her children. And so that idea really interested me. And then both the fairy tale and the myth had a lot to do with that too.
Yeah. And you're both looking, I mean, you're also looking at, a lot of things that we didn't have vocabulary for in the 90s in the same way. You're looking at a character who is neurodivergent, and you're looking at, um, you know, gender non-identification, and you couldn't talk about it the way we do now, because that would be anachronistic. And so you had to think of different way, like remember back to what parents would have, what framework would they have had to understand their child 20 years ago versus now. And what was
Yeah.
that like? And, what, I guess, I mean, first of all, I want to say, I love George. George is an incredible character. And I think you said, and it's not, I think you did it well enough that, or you did it so well, but was it hard to write a character without ever mentioning a pronoun as a way of, I guess, sort of working around the fact that there wasn't really a way to do it that was true to the era, but that felt right for you in this book?
Yeah, that was really challenging because at first I was using they because, George is definitely non-binary and kind of gender non-conforming, and not even clear about how they identify yet, reaching toward it because there's so little
Right.
framework for how they feel and who they are. There is an old couple that I mentioned a little bit, mentioned Velma in the part that I read about Powell's that George takes care of, that lives in an SRO in Old Town, and George does offers them some medical help and does needle exchange for them. They're a couple who's has an addiction, but part of what George gets out of helping these people is that they're a queer couple that George can really relate to. So there's this, but it's hard. It's hard to find that that model for, oh yeah, this is kind of who I'm like, or how I'm like, and what I can use to call myself, and how I can think about, the way that I intrinsically feel like I am. And so I decided that I was going to see if I could write without using any pronouns for George. And it did cause me to have to really consider my sentence construction at times in a really irritating way. But as I got going, it was like nothing. It was fine. it was like I just had to get my brain and it actually, I think, made for some more interesting stuff on the sentence level, because I couldn't just rely on.
Right. That kind of challenge makes your brain take a different path. And so,
Yeah.
yeah.
So in the end, I think it worked out. We had to really, there was a few times where it was really clunky and I had to super rework.
Yeah.
But yeah, hopefully,
Well,
yeah.
yeah. I mean, I love the way that, that George was portrayed all the way through. And it didn't occur to me that you hadn't used a pronoun, but it was until I read that you said that. And I thought that was a really interesting challenge. But also, and then when it comes to Orr, he's he's struggling with issues that haven't been identified necessarily or diagnosed and he's living in a world still in which there's a very narrow box for him to fit in, and this is not going so well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that really reflects, I think, some of my experience as a parent. And, there were very narrow definitions of neurodivergence, and there still are. They're changing all the time. A doctor that I finally met and really respect sees it all as a continuum. He really, he feels like the names, and again, diagnosis is only helpful if it helps you get the help you need, right? Or a label is only helpful if it helps you get the help that you need. And I think that a lot of parents seeing that narrowness, especially during that time, just refused to go down that diagnostic road with their child, which is something that would be very much like Orr's mother, who's kind of, a rebel and, very countercultural sort of, and distrustful of that kind of label. And so the family just accepts him sort of as this is who he is. But it's hard because as he's getting older, he does want to expand his world, but he doesn't know how to do that. And being thrown out into the world, even though the way he was thrown out into the world was not ideal, does have some positive consequences for his development, but also, without giving a spoiler, some really intense consequences too.
Yes, and I mean, there's so much I want to say, but we have some
yeah,
attendee questions. But first, I wanted to say, like, I don't know if there's even a name for this kind of trope, but it struck me reading both of your books that this sort of kindness of strangers trope. I don't know, but the main characters sort of thrown out into the world on their own due to circumstance, and who have the course of their life determined by the strangers that they meet and who rescue them or endanger them. And but I didn't even consciously, I think realize how much I love that trope until like seeing it, twice in your books, and just that there is a very fairy tale quality to it too, that meeting the old lady at the crossroads or whatever. I just wanted to comment on that and see what you have to say, but also the idea of like how using magical realism to consider the kind of things we were just talking about with with what happened, with what Orr is going through, like what kind of a tool that is for you to be able to look at things on different levels, or how would you express that, I guess?
I think for me, everything is like, the magical realism is so close to my realism for my reality for me, that it's not a very big leap to see where it would go. So I can, I'm just like, every day I'm just getting ready for my dog to just talk to me. I'm pretty sure she will. And I won't be that surprised when that happens, so it's like, I feel especially, especially with my draw to sort of, animal human transformation stories, and also just the way that I think magic realism allows us to talk about internal processes that are really just happening in us. It allows us to find a way to express it sort of visually and physically. And that is the thing I think that really helped me with this story, is I thought, how would these characters transform physically and visibly and tangibly if the rules were just slightly looser, and if the boundary between fairy tale reality and our reality is just a wee bit thinner? And that sort of is where that ending, and that transformation comes from. And the kindness of strangers as a trope, I'm realizing I love that too, and I am going to go now and see where I can find that, because I guess I am really using that. No, you're totally right.
I mean, I don't. I mean, I think you're very intuitive in that way too. That I love, I guess I respond to tropes and recognize, oh, there's a reason that tropes exist because
Yeah,
I
no,
feel
because
like
they
they're
resonate.
the shortcut straight to like, the story center
Yeah,
of our soul. And
yeah,
we recognize them when they're overdone or they annoy us, but we tend to not recognize them when they're doing their job and just like connecting with us on that deeper level, and we love it, but we don't necessarily examine why, or even that we're seeing it repeatedly. But anyway, so I just, because it happens in both of your books and I loved it the way it was done, that just, yeah, it just occurred to me, like, what's that called?
no, I love that. Now I'm gonna like go check it out.
Yeah. All right, let me read you a couple of these questions from our
Sure.
audience. Jasper would like to know, what prep work did you do for this new book, and when did you feel comfortable retelling, blending in Greek mythology?
Well, let's see. I actually came up with this book idea. I was applying for residency, and it was sort of in that middle time where All of Us with Wings was off being edited. And I originally thought it was going to be an adult book. So I had an adult project I was working on, but then I found out no, it was actually going to be a young adult book, and I should probably think about a young adult project. And I was applying for the residency, and they said, "What are you working on next?" And I just like made it up, which is kind of how I started All of Us with Wings, right? I just gave a little synopsis for the kids to vote on. So yeah, I just kind of made it up for the residency. I'm like, okay, I'm going to mash up brother and sister and Iphigenia and Orestes, and they're going to be on their own in 90s Portland. I mean, who knows how that came out. And then I had to figure out how that was going to work. And I thought there was going to be more of like a cult aspect to it because I had been reading about Artemis cults and was very fascinated by that. But as it turns out, there's a little bit of bear and bee imagery in there, but that's about as Artemis cult as it got. So maybe another book for that.
Yeah.
And as far as mixing them together, like it's a blender up in here. Like it's like
How
there's
much
a
of
bunch.
your reading
I
is,
haven't even talked about the other stuff that like went into it because there's just it's blendery for me. It's how it works.
like, how much do you still actively like how much do you actively read nonfiction and this kind of these kind of books, and how much of it is just in your head from the past? And you didn't mention the mythology and folklore section at Powell's as a haunt, but I'm sure you must go there a lot too.
Oh, that's my section. And I was really freaked out because it used to have fairy tale and mythology separate. And last time I was there, I was like, I had to go talk to someone. I was like, oh my God. But actually it's all mixed in. It's okay. And I figured out, what I needed to know. But I
I
freaked.
haven't been to I haven't been to the section in the Big Pals for a long time, but
Yeah.
I used to go there first for a long time. Yeah.
Oh yeah. I mean, I still it depends. Like I have a thing that I'm actually working on something that's also fairy tale related now. So yeah, I'm reading a lot of fairy tales again. Um, but a lot of times it's stuff that's all been kind of in there rolling around. And then I have to go back and reread is what happens because I don't remember what I read that well, to be honest. I have to go back a lot.
I mean, that's how it synthesizes, I think, by just getting sort of like taken apart and floating around. But I'm really
Yeah.
excited because my 11-year-old daughter is like super obsessed with mythology right now. And I'm just
Nice.
thinking, she's also a writer, of course. And so like just knowing that all of that stuff is going into the, that for the rest, I was just telling her like today, like for the rest of your life, like that will be being churned around and coming out as
Yes,
stories.
absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. So anonymous attendee says that they just got their arc of the book today. So excited to pick it up. Love reading retellings and was wondering which other retellings you would recommend, or Greek plays or otherwise. Do you have any?
Oh, let's see. I'm trying to think of Greek plays. I know a lot. I'm thinking more fairy tale retellings as I sit here.
There's
The
Madeline Miller, of course.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Madeline Miller, of course. Yes.
But
Oh, and
I don't think
actually,
I have to mention
Mary Renault, actually, that's old. Mary Renault is like from the 30s or something, right?
Right. Yeah.
The King Must Die. Oh my God, that is so good. It's the Theseus stories, and it's amazing. For fairy tale retellings, my go-to is Helen Oyeyemi. She is like my, in my pantheon. She is very high. Helen Oyeyemi is a British writer and has done some amazing retellings. So I mean, several. There's Boy Snow Bird. Her Mr. Fox, though, I think might be my favorite ever retelling, and it's so brilliant. I don't know how she even did it.
Yeah, that's the only one of hers I've read, actually.
Oh,
But I
it's
always
so
think,
good. Oh, I can, yeah, I will, we'll talk.
yeah, I have so much to read.
I see a book
Okay,
group in our office.
do you plan to continue to write plays also?
I wrote the first theater piece I've written in ages this winter over quarantine. A friend of mine is Samantha Vandermeer from Shaking the Tree Theater, who is, in my opinion, just the most amazing theater in town. She's very experimental and really collaborative in the way that she works. So she asked a bunch of writers and actors to embody a goddess and to write a monologue from that goddess's perspective. And there was an installation where you could go with your pod, and she's also a painter and a visual artist, and she did these amazing panels, and then the goddess's pieces played. I also recorded the piece that I wrote, and that was really fun. And so now it's like
What goddess did you do?
she made them. It was like kind of goddesses that she made up, but mine was the goddess of the water beneath the water.
Oh,
So very deep subconscious
oh,
stuff. And sometimes I even think about acting again, because I'm old enough now to play the really good parts, like the evil female parts.
yeah.
No more ingenue. So I'm like,
Right. The stuff you can really sink your teeth into.
yeah.
Okay, and that same anonymous attendee is curious if having a deadline for your book was okay in the end. And actually, was it positive?
It was actually. I at Hedgebrook at the residency, one of the other authors was having a really hard time writing her next thing, and said that she thinks it was actually, because I came in going, I was so stupid. Why did I do this? Oh my God. And she's like, no, you were smart. And now you have this residency and you're going to finish. And it was so funny because like
Congrats
her,
to those reader. I mean,
yeah,
but I've experienced that for sure. I mean, like, that my current book was sold on pitch. Actually, my last 4 books, I think, have been sold on
right.
pitch because I was with the same publisher for a long time, but this one's with a new publisher. But I really got up in my head about it, because then you start thinking, is this the book they thought they were buying? And then I got myself so psyched up, and I was like, found myself, wishing that I could just write a book and then sell it, and then realizing how privileged I am to be able to sell a book on pitch, and how I'm not going to get any sympathy for that, but
Yeah.
really it is a thing. You do get really up in your head, but then on the other hand, it is really nice to be able to sell a book on pitch. So
Right. Like right now, I'm sort of back to square one in a certain way, because I'm not going to try to sell this one on proposal because it's so different. My next book will be an adult book, and I just feel like I don't know what it is enough to even like tell someone what it might be. So, yeah, I'm
so
kind of
you have
back
to
to
keep
square
on
one.
motivating yourself.
Yes, and that's a whole nother thing. But it's also an exciting skill to have, because if you can motivate yourself, you can do whatever you want.
And at a certain point in the process, it starts to come together. It doesn't have to be finished necessarily when you feel ready to pitch it.
Yes, absolutely. I'm just getting my brain together.
Yeah, no, and I'm sort of daydreaming of being able to be in that position again. So we'll see.
Yes.
And then I'm sure then I'll be like, oh, I wish this
Different
book was sold, but no.
Yes.
And okay, let's see. One more question, maybe. We are almost out of time. Can you talk about handling endings?
Yeah. Endings, mostly by the time I've gotten to the ending, I understand the ending. And I know where it will end. All of Us with Wings ended. I knew all the things that needed to happen before I could end. Let's put it that way. And I knew I wanted to end that story in the kitchen with the whole family. So I knew where I would be, and then I just had to kind of write into what happened then. And I'd, look at it and be like, no, that's not what would happen. Like I had to really find the truth of it. With this book, I also knew what would happen at the end, but I had to really feel into what the ending would feel like for everyone. The emotion of the ending was very difficult for me this time. Yeah, the emotion of the end was hard.
Quite a situation.
Yes, and it's and I feel like I did sort of and there's kind of an epilogue to this book, and I felt much better when I realized I could write an epilogue, and I felt satisfied when I could finally write an epilogue. I think we needed to know like 6 months later what's happening, just to not leave them,
with endings,
where I left them.
There's being in the right moment and nailing what happens and even how it feels, but then there's finding just the right final lines to, lead your reader out of it. And that, I don't know about for you, but that's tricky. Those are tricky lines to write and to
They
feel
are.
the conclusion, the feeling I want to leave people with. And
yeah, the last lines are really hard. They're really, really hard. Sometimes I think that the best place to find them is somewhere in the book, though. I think you leave the last line someplace in the book and you just have to find it and
interesting.
pop it there. I found that to be the case with 2 books. We'll see if that if that holds true the next time, but
yeah, we'll be looking for it.
Yes.
Well, thank you, Michelle, so much.
Thank you so much, Laini. We could talk forever. And I love talking to you about this stuff.
Yes, me too.
Well, thank you both so much for joining us tonight. And we're grateful for you both being here. And everyone out there, please consider purchasing a copy of Michelle's gorgeous new book here. Let's see, I got it there too. And cool. Well, be sure to check out our lineup of other upcoming virtual events. And we look forward to seeing you at another one of our events soon. So Michelle and Laini, thanks again so much. And we appreciate you. And thanks for the wonderful conversation. All right. Good night. Yeah.
Enjoy your cake, Michelle.
Yes.
Thank you, Laini. I'll post pictures.
Yes.
All right. Good night, everyone. Bye.